Between hour 1 and hour 2, there had been enormous activity inside and immediately around the vicinity of the installation known as Fort Hood. This massive American Army active duty installation that had nearly 40,000 troops within it at the time of the invasion, along with approximately 35,000 civilians, whether workers or dependents, when it came to the soldiers on the installation. The enormous battle that had broken out at midnight was now extremely intense in terms of the sheer quantities of munitions lobbed at the installation itself, in addition to the clearing of the flanks going on around the installation, including fighting going on in the city of Temple. Temple itself was a medium-sized city and would take a little bit of time to thoroughly clear, as an armored battalion from the 17th Armored Brigade of the PLA 68th Group Army of the invasion forces of the coalition was methodically going up and down the different streets, clearing every building in sight, with the armored infantry forces supported by their tank companies, as there were 2 armored infantry companies in this tank battalion, an anti-tank company consisting of their HJ-10 equipped 8-pod AFT-10 systems. In addition to their 4 tank companies, the armored infantry companies were busy clearing buildings as well as methodically pushing armed civilians deeper into the city, where they were to eventually be surrounded and destroyed. This took time, as urban conflict was one of clearing a labyrinth of different structures, and tank shells were beginning to fly and severely damage or destroy certain buildings and cities as they were where they were taking from different civilians, leading them into pockets. This was going on. The headquarters battalion of the 17th Armored Brigade moved into the city, I-35, established a command post and logistics, a temporary bivouac command post, as one of their battalions was methodically clearing resistance, as I-35 again was a main invasion route for the external forces moving up from Mexico and needed to be cleared, especially around urban areas, of any armed resistance whatsoever at all, as urban centers pose the most serious threat to supply lines due to the nature of urban guerrilla warfare, and that the fact that the logistical or administrative or command vehicles were generally much lighter and less protected than were the combat vehicles of the convoying externals moving up the highway. And in order for them to move as quickly and easily as possible, the Trojans were left with the task of clearing all urban areas adjacent to the interstate of any formal organized armed resistance. That was a key, vital objective of this invasion. In addition, the forces invading the installation were coming in from the west, hitting all the way from the northernmost portion of the western side of the post to the southernmost portions, with the Russian forces consisting of the 16th Tank Division, the 105th Logistical Support Brigade, and the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, sending all their units with heavy artillery fire support from their self-propelled guns, consisting of their 2 S-19-MSTA-S self-propelled artillery howitzer systems, which equipped both the artillery battalion of the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, in addition to the artillery battalion of the 16th Tank Division. Within the first hour alone, 2 armored battalions had cleared the city of Copper's Cove of armed civilian resistance, crushing and destroying them and aligning themselves in southern Copper's Cove along portions of the Fort Hood boundary to West Fort Hood, which this area was known as West Fort Hood, that jutted to the south. While that was occurring, while these forces guarded the flanks and cleared it of armed resistance from these armed civilians, these these Russian armored forces, including mechanized armored infantry battalions from their 16th Tank Division, and also 4 logistical support battalions from the 105th Logistical Support Brigade, with these 4 armored battalions, punched into the installation and performed a maneuver similar to what the Americans had done in Iraq with Baghdad, doing a thunder run, essentially cutting through these weaker units of MPs and racing deep into the installation as they had more important targets to go after, such as all the armed units that were training throughout the installation. As this was occurring, the Chinese were doing the very same, as their artillery was hitting different positions that consisted of MP companies from different battalions of the 89th MP Brigade, including right here and right here, who were patrolling different parts of the installation. This area right here, consisting of the Fort Hood-Killeen Regional Airport, actually on post property. These armored forces and combat engineers here sliced through the installation, actually going up and through the airfield itself, before artillery fire came in from their own artillery, as 5 different artillery battalions, including their PHL-03 Heavy Rocket Battalion with 300mm rockets from the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade, moved into Nolanville and set up positions and fired, including heavy rocket fire, into the airport, as the elements from the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, including combat engineers and a mechanized infantry battalion, had already stormed into the post and attacked a grouping of MPs, having been heavily shelled by the 16th Tank Division's artillery battalion with 152mm shells. As these forces moved in, including an air defense artillery battalion, a short-range air defense artillery battalion, moving into the installation and establishing a position in these training areas, while the combat engineers and mechanized infantry within the first hour cleared these on-post housing areas before moving further in after defeating some armed MPs and holding their position here as the tank, mechanized infantry, and logistical forces sliced through the area before moving again to attack the western side of the airfield, which was now under heavy bombardment from Chinese and even some Russian artillery, hitting just to the north in the railhead area. We go now to the local map, which was the area that was under assault by the combat engineers and mechanized infantry battalion, with 2 combat engineer companies out of their combat engineer battalion spearheading the attack. As there had been fencing put up, concertina and barbed wire fencing some time ago, placed there by U.S. Army combat engineers to separate this post-housing neighborhood here from the airfield area, which the airfield was huge, and this was only a tiny portion of it. This was the main runway here, and this was a taxiway for aircraft. There were multiple buildings on this airfield, including terminals on the other side that were now being heavily rocketed by Chinese 300mm rocket fire, as indicated here, including parts of the airfield itself. The PHL-03 300mm rocket battalion, with all of its firing batteries, with about 8 systems per battery, were laying enormous fire on this airfield, totally wrecking it, as tactical ballistic missiles also came in and hit. There were a mix of Chinese ballistic missiles in the form of DF-15Bs, as well as Russian Iskanders, which were fired from their very own 2nd Combined Arms Army's 950th Rocket Brigade, which was in the San Antonio area, as that battle was being conducted by other Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army units. At the time, there were American troops about to do a training deployment to Fort Irwin in California, and they were about to board a contracted civilian airliner that was on the tarmac at the time of the invasion. By the time these combat engineers and mechanized infantry troops behind them had reached the airfield and the southernmost portions of the railhead, as the railhead extended north and off this map and had tracks running to the southwest from the main railhead area that was just north of this area right here. These combat engineers, equipped with their B-12 M2 engineering vehicles, which were these, that spearheaded their platoon's attacks of this company right here and this platoon of another company up here were smashing their way into this airfield area, having traversed through this neighborhood of shelled houses from earlier Russian artillery fire before these forces were moving in to clean up whatever resistance remained. As earlier in the fighting, again, Chinese and Russian forces cut straight through the airfield in their very own thunder run, heading deep into the post to fight the actual combat units that had weapons and equipment that were actually signed out with actual munitions as well, as they took priority over these lightly defended areas that consisted simply of MPs and troops that had weapons with them that were signed out, as they were, before the invasion, planning on going to Fort Irwin for training, but they didn't have ammunition, which was a major issue. As this fighting was occurring and 2 o'clock struck, close by systems of Club Ks and YJ-18Cs began to fire off their cruise missiles, as evident by these different missiles here, and Russians fired Lancet 3s, which, like their Chinese CH-901A counterparts, actually had an AI targeting system, as the Lancet 3, again, had come a very long way from its original iterations, and had been proven time and again in combat as a very reliable loitering munition. It was fired by the headquarters battalion of the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, which itself had moved into the area and was well within range to fire their Lancets into West Fort Hood to aid their own Combat Engineer Battalion and Mechanized Infantry Battalion as they moved in to clean up the area of any American forces. As they were moving in this large map, this map being a 2-mile by 1-mile map, they moved through this area with their headquarters platoons staying behind, with only the Mechanized Infantry headquarters platoon moving up to here before conducting a star formation like these troops by the tracks of the Combat Engineer Company operating in the area. This is their headquarters platoon. The Combat Engineers, besides their engineering vehicle, which was the B-12M2, also had BMP-3s as their infantry fighting vehicle and 3 MTLB tracked infantry fighting vehicles, and in addition to their BMP-3 and their B-12M2 armored engineering vehicle. It was equipped with a PKT machine gun, which was essentially a general purpose machine gun that was 7.62 by 54 millimeter, which was still a fairly potent weapon. But the BMP-3 had the heaviest firepower out of these platoons, boasting as an infantry fighting vehicle a 100 millimeter cannon and 30 millimeter autocannon and 7.62 millimeter coax machine gun, just like the Chinese ZBD-04As or their brand new VN-20s, which were even more protected and more advanced than their ZBD-04A counterparts, which actually were fairly high tech when looking at their specifications. These MTLB tracked armor personnel carriers had turret machine guns in the form of 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns, the DD-SHKs. These mechanized infantry forces were configured almost the same way, minus the armored engineering vehicle, but adding an MLTB to their platoons. They had a BMP-3 and 4 MTLB tracked armor personnel carriers. As the combat engineers spearheaded the attack, they had dismounted a few of their platoons to scout ahead, bounding and covering tactically as this group bounded here, this group bounded here a little bit ahead, then they bounded ahead into this drainage ditch, then they bounded into the drainage ditch, and the same went with this squad right here. They bounded up this steep elevation, getting up top, and they got into the ditch, and then they climbed up out of it and bounded. As these vehicles here, smashing through this fencing that had been erected, the razor wire and barbed wire fence line here, they had moved to a part of the elevation that they could actually get up because it gradually went up so that they could actually get their vehicles up this slope. which was at the perfect gradient for them to be able to climb it. And there was a bridge here as their ISR assets, their own quadcopter reconnaissance drones, as they actually had a functioning drone doctrine built into their army, just like the PLA. So every squad of the Russians also had quadcopter reconnaissance drone aircraft. And they constantly were monitoring the battlefield as they went on. So they scouted ahead, seen the bridge, and the combat engineers smashed through this fencing with their multi-purpose B-12M2 armored engineering vehicle, and they moved up and crossed the bridge. In doing so, the mechanized infantry were following right behind them, stopping here as they went first, with the mechanized infantry platoon here of 5 vehicles, with one running over this rubbled house here. Moving through this rubbled home here, temporarily stopping as the engineers went forward. And then they moved to this point here and stopped as they were on this higher elevation. And as they stopped and these troops moved forward, down here, this squad here had bounded up out of the drainage ditch, and as the vehicles moved forward, they began to take some contact as there were Americans behind this fence along the airfield. And a Max Pro MRAP armed with a 50 cal machine gun and a squad of 10 troops here with small arms that were MPs were firing at these Russian combat engineers as they came into sight. They crossed this street right here, this road that ran parallel to the airfield area. As there was more of the airfield, as it went down, it sort of jutted out some, but this road kind of wound down this way along with the fence line. They bounded and covered, and the vehicles moved while firing at this group right here. As Lancet 3 loitering munitions came in to give them enormous support. As all of this was going on and the cruise missiles were moving through the area and the enormous rocket artillery was pounding the eastern portion of the airfield, simply saturating it, and tactical ballistic missiles were hitting different parts of the airfield itself, as well as leveling half of this large airport building, or this airfield building right here. This crater marker right here with the smoke indicates where a tactical ballistic missile hit a Russian Iskander, and these two are Russian Iskanders coming straight down upon this civilian contracted jet airliner that was to take these troops to training, including others in the main terminals, to training at Fort Irwin, California. This is just one of the taxiways, and this was the main runway with more taxiways on the other side and more buildings for the airfield. As these forces here were defeated by the combination of loitering munitions as well as vehicle-based fire from the combat engineering platoon of vehicles, now having reached the summit, crossing this drainage ditch bridge, crossing the street, and now taking fire while dishing fire out here, these forces surrounded in blue were now completely defeated. As all of that was occurring, there were American forces right here that jumped down into the drainage ditch trying to run for cover. And as they ran through the drainage ditch, they were hit by these Lancet 3s that were armed with HE warheads. These troops right here, in this grouping right here, were attempting to run out of this area and into the ditch for cover as well, where they attempted to put up a fight, but instead were destroyed with the others. As that was going on, this squad right here had bounded and gotten into the ditch, was now moving along the ditch itself. As they were going to engage, firing up over the road, these Americans that were now running this way but then veered this way, as these Russian forces, including this platoon right here of combat engineers as well as this dismounted squad of combat engineers, was moving into place, and they began taking fire from these Americans that got up on this high ground that were armed. They were MPs, and they were fighting back, but of course they were destroyed, as indicated by the arrow surrounded in blue. Many of these things were happening simultaneously. Therefore, it is difficult to convey them in a rational order. However, it will be attempted to do so as best as possible. These forces here were running this way, and they were armed MPs as well. This P stands for a parking lot. There were parked LMTV trucks right here, and there were MPs and other personnel inside this building. Personnel that had signed out their weapons to go to training at Fort Irwin, but didn't have any ammunition, as when you get on those flights, you have your personal weapon, your personal small arm, your rifle, but you don't have any ammo for it. You stow it away under your seat. They had no ammunition except for the MPs, and the MPs were trying their best to fight back, but they didn't realize the magnitude of the attack going on because, again, the anti-satellite and cyber strike happening at midnight defeated all their communications and abilities to have any actionable intel. They had no idea what was going on, where enemies were coming from, and when they saw the tanks and armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, support vehicles, and more of Chinese and Russian forces racing up through this airfield earlier before the rocket strikes came in and that hadn't engaged them, they knew something massive was afoot, even before the strikes came in from missiles and artillery a little bit later. As these forces had broken into 4 different prongs running different ways, precision artillery strikes were called in upon them by the ISR assets of these different combat engineer squads that were monitoring the battlefield, seeing what all kind of movement had been going on, including even a Lancet III hitting a grouping of them with an HE warhead on AI targeting mode. This Russian combat engineer platoon as well had moved up this gradual sloping hill and was able to get up on top before moving around to this area here. As these YJ-18C/Club K cruise missiles began to fly in at hour number 2 as this battle was going on. This battle literally lasted from just before the second hour mark into the second hour. And by the time they reached here, this Lancet III, along with these dismounted squads who were engaging Americans over here, as well as over here, along with the artillery strikes called in, had eliminated all of these Americans that had run up to this hill and tried to lay down some fire against these Russian dismounts here, which were bounding and covering tactically. They bounded, first they bounded, then they bounded a little ahead, then they bounded a little ahead, and they were firing at these Americans over here who had run this way but were eventually cut down by all the fire coming from these 2 squads right here. This squad of patrolling MPs along this razor and concertina wire and barbed wire fence line, the concertina and barbed wire fence line, they had been eliminated very early on in the fighting as the dismounts moving into the area had cut them down before even reaching right here, coming up the hill. As they advanced, their light machine gun fire from their RPK-74s and also their rifle fire from their AK-74Ms were devastating against the mostly unarmed Americans, such as those in this little portion of the railhead right here that had tried to run and were completely cut down by 5.45 by 39 millimeter rounds. And as that was going on, there was another mechanized infantry company and combat engineer company spearheading the assault up to the north going on in the railhead. This was just a tiny part of the railhead with all of these platforms here. And as these 2 dismounted squads from this combat engineer platoon had fired upon this area as their vehicles broke in, and they broke in through this chain link fencing, this squad peeled off to clear this building as this squad had and vehicle fire from the lead vehicle, this B-12M2 armored engineering vehicle, simply cut these unarmed troops down as they tried to run away. They could have surrendered, but they tried to run instead, and they were cut down for it. And as this building was being cleared, these troops up here cleared this platform area, eliminating all these soldiers that refused to surrender on these platforms that were in circles. in the blue. As they bounded it forward, they coordinated their movements with other dismounted squads just to the north off the map in the other parts of the railhead. As that was occurring, these vehicles of this combat engineer platoon right here that had stopped here temporarily were now beginning to move through the installation before stopping here temporarily and opening fire on these American forces, including this dismounted squad, doing the same as they reached the end of this platform with this ramp right here where these LMTV trucks are parked. They laid down some heavy fire in the prone position against these attempting to retreat Americans, as before they even got there, they had laid down fire as indicated by the blue, and they tried to run and were instead cut down for trying to escape, and they didn't try to surrender. And as this platoon of vehicles had stopped here, they waited for this squad to finish clearing this building, which they did before bounding and coming to conduct a rolling shield maneuver with this platoon of vehicles that stopped right here. The dismounted squad was of this platoon right here from this other company that was further off the map. This is just one small platoon from the whole company of the Combat Engineer Battalion. Behind them, the mechanized infantry battalions were still moving up. As over here, they stopped as the combat engineers reconned ahead, as combat engineers were excellent reconnaissance units, as that was what they were intended for, to conduct recons in force and clear fortified areas, as they had smashed through fencing and did so with ease with their armored engineering vehicles. With the mechanized infantry coming in behind and getting up on the side of the hill, but not climbing all the way up, as they were waiting for the combat engineers to do all the heavy lifting, so to speak, as they were going to clear out this remaining airport structure of any and all enemy resistance, as they were also clearing the exterior of it, including the parking lot right here with all of these LMTV trucks from which these different groupings of troops had ran for cover in the drainage ditch or trying to get uphill to fight back, including here and here, before these vehicle platoons and their dismounted troops moved into the area, with this vehicle platoon moving up into the parking lot by these LMTVs, as well as this vehicle platoon moving, this was the one that moved up, as well as this one right here moving up to here, before finally moving to the building, before releasing troops to clear it, taking heavy fire. As that was going on, these two dismounted squads from this very same platoon had by this point, after the artillery strikes, one moved into this drainage ditch right here for cover, as these American troops were fleeing the area and they were firing at them. And as they fired at them and they tried to move up the street, this group here, conducting the rolling shield maneuver that had stopped, fired at them as well and called in precision artillery strikes where they were anticipated to be via drone recon. As again, this is a fairly large map. This is a 1 mile by 2 mile map right here. So as they were running these hundreds of meters, the quadcopter reconnaissance drone reconned this area and called in 2 shells to hit there as they were anticipated to get to that point. As these vehicles and dismounted troops, including those taking cover in the drainage ditch firing at them, had already wounded severely many of them, but didn't kill all of them as they had body armor. And the vehicle fire, the PKT machine gun on the lead vehicle fired at some of them and badly maimed a few and killed another, but there were still survivors, so the shells came in and finished off the survivors, while others had been cut down by the small arms and vehicle fire, or badly wounded by it and then destroyed by the shell fire. After that occurred, this squad went this way and then up out of the drainage ditch, crossing the street, bounding here, as this other squad tactically bounded and covered with them towards the building, where the vehicles were dismounting other squads into from their platoon. And they, also dismounted from this very same platoon, were now raiding the building as they went in through the destroyed, rubbled part. This building was badly gutted, and the different floors of it were exposed, and these troops were able to go inside and clear out the building, as in conjunction with these dismounted troops of these two squads that smashed through this fencing as their vehicles had pulled up to it to provide them any necessary fire support after having destroyed these forces here and here that ran in the ditch with the lancets assisting them. They then bounded into this building in different entryways, and they entered along with the other two squads and the other three squads from this platoon that dismounted their vehicles and went inside and cleared out this entire building that had about 40 troops in it. And as they entered, they took some fire, as indicated by these green arrows, and they had fired on the building before even entering it, as indicated by this blue right here, and they placed some C4 on it as well and blasted it before entering it. They stood a safe distance away after they planted it, of course. They blew this hole open, and then they went in this way, as there was a door here, and they just went through this door. And as that was going on, as they cleared this building, the missiles were flying all throughout the installation. And these Lancet drones were flying further to the northeast to assist other units elsewhere on the installation. As again, the installation was now at a point where all there was lines of contact. There was no front line or anything like this. The whole purpose of assaulting this enormously sized installation like this was to break up all the different American forces and smash them bit by bit, not even giving them a chance to even respond. And as most American units on the installation were partying at the time of this invasion, that was indeed the case, at least for the main post. All that really was there to resist on the main post were MPs and a very few fortunate soldiers that somehow, some way, had armorers get to the arms room and just start tossing rifles out regardless of whose rifle it was. They didn't do a signing out process, and even handing them out at a frantic pace like this would take some time, and they were never able to arm their entire companies this way, as by the time even some of the troops got to their arms, Chinese or Russian troops were running into the basements of the buildings, pointing rifles at them and causing them to surrender. They had overrun the installation that quick. It was already now only 2 hours into it, and all of this was already occurring with Russian and Chinese armor racing deep into the installation. They literally were racing and charging towards the middle of the installation, surrounding and destroying any enemies upon which they encountered. As this T-80U with all its ERA armor kits on it, and the Chinese Type 99A without ERA on the sides and back, but very powerful main battle tanks. Some of them had it, but most of them had it, but some didn't. Like this tank platoon here, but they were coming in and smashing their way through as this flimsy fence is being hit by tank shells and just shredded open, along with trees and everything else. And the installation here, you have CH-901A in the air there, you have artillery shells hitting a building aflame, and Chinese troops climbing up in the windows with grappling hooks, having thrown a grenade up in there to clear the room before climbing up in it, with troops pointing rifles up at it until he makes it close enough to get in to man the window to make sure nobody's going to try and mess with the grappling hook or throw it out, make him fall. That's why the purpose of throwing the grenade in first was SOP for grappling operations like that on a building. Of course, you have the coax firing and main gun firing, turret machine gunner firing. This place was getting ripped up to pieces. It was getting completely annihilated. Of course, you have these Type 99As up here roaming through the field of battle. This would have been a sight on each and every installation. These tanks rolling by obliterated vehicles and troops that were just laying KIA'd on the battlefield, including those with shredded limbs ripped off. Like this unfortunate man right here who lost a leg and an arm. It was bad. This guy This MRAP, as it got hit by a tank shell, flipped over onto this guy on this, just the side of it, causing it to roll due to the high velocity of the shell. These battles were beyond intense. There was really no way to articulate the seriousness of what was actually occurring on these installations at this time. As the forces that were spearheading the effort in this area of the airfield to cleanse the area of any enemy forces, they had cleared this building and wiped out all the armed resistance and taken the rest as POWs. Even though the MPs tried to lay down fire on these engineering vehicles that pulled straight up to one of the entryways to dismount troops into it from the rest of their platoon, that besides these two squads that went in through the damaged areas, the MPs were defeated, and they blasted this wall open with C4 in this part of the building, and the other troops just ran in. They took a little fire, but they were wearing very good body armor, just like the Chinese had excellent body armor, and they simply wiped out the American forces present. They only had 1 KIA, and they had 5 WIAs, and as for the Americans, dozens of them were annihilated just on this map alone, with dozens more becoming POWs, most of them having no way to resist as they had no firearm or ammunition at the time, or if they did have firearms, like the troops that were getting ready to go overseas to board the aircraft, they had firearms, but they had no ammunition for it. That was part of the major setup for failure, as American installations were never really well beefed up in terms of having troops that were always armed, apart from MPs, as most of the other troops were mostly unarmed unless they were out training, doing FTX field exercises, or they were essentially going different places like deployments or other training to other installations. Those were the only times the troops really were able to sign out arms or ammunition, like if they went to the range or training. Most of the time, the troops were unarmed during daily work days, which was a major setup for this type of failure, including installations being extremely weakly defended. Even with certain measures put in place, like some better fencing around certain key logistical areas like a railhead or the airfield, it did little to stop this scale of an assault, of an invasion, as these dismounted combat engineers completely annihilated the fencing, as they were experts at that type of thing. Where they couldn't open doors, they made their own doors by planting charges and blasting their way in. They were fully capable of clearing landmines, but the Americans hadn't laid any landmines, which made this type of mission exceedingly easy. Plus, the Russians and Chinese had total artillery domination, ISR dominance, artificial intelligence dominance, electronic warfare dominance, hypersonic missiles, total missile number dominance in tactical ballistic and also in cruise missiles, air-to-ground missiles, anti-tank missiles. These forces were well prepared for war. The sheer aggregate numbers of stockpiled munitions and weapons and vehicles and platforms over all the years, especially during the Cold War and even beyond, made China and Russia exceedingly wealthy in terms of military power. Unbeknownst to most Westerners, the Russians and Chinese had literally tens of thousands of tanks and armored fighting vehicles. They had decent-sized helicopter fleets, and even the Chinese now were building more, but helicopters had taken a back seat because of the advances in air defenses. Though not totally obsolete, helicopters had their place, but their place was not that of the Gulf War era Apaches or Cobras going in and destroying whole tank battalions. No. The helicopter was utilized once air defense was neutralized. And electronic warfare proved decisive in the role of neutralizing enemy radars, as well as their communications, their redundant communications of radio itself. as new electronic warfare jamming systems, which utilized electromagnetic jamming signals, could pinpoint the origin of radio signals of enemy forces and radar and precisely jam it. This made it exceedingly easy to conduct SEAD operations to finish off those systems while the electronic warfare was doing the job of jamming them. The Americans were totally unprepared, as the Chinese and Russians had both come an extremely long way in terms of their technology, in terms of their proficiency and training and combat readiness, especially both nations having combat experience, China's being most recently from deploying combat troops to the Syrian civil war in the form of special operations forces, such as the Night Tigers Special Operations Forces. China had very illustrious names for many of their special forces battalions and even whole brigades, which were typically attached to a group army. The Russians as well had deployed ground troops there, and as well as their great proxy war in Europe. The Chinese and Russians were together an unstoppable force, and even China alone was an unstoppable force by sheer weight of numbers and technology. China had the most advanced technology in the world, and the rest of the world refused to believe it until the technology came to destroy them in the form of China's drone dominance, in the form of their missile dominance, armor dominance, aerial dominance, and naval dominance. And it all showed. And it showed, again, to weight of numbers and also the level of technology and how far they've come, saving tons of money on research and development from their infiltration and their wide-reaching intelligence arm, including academic intelligence, having pirated many intellectual properties, utilizing them to advance ahead of the West, saving them years and money on R&D, and now they have leapfrogged ahead to where their air-to-air missiles are the best in the world, like the PL-15, over-the-horizon strike capability against enemy aircraft, before the enemy even knows that they're being hit by a PL-15 coming from 200 plus miles away. These Russian forces were extremely potent forces as well. And as these combat engineers cleared the field of battle, with their allies rocketing the rest of the airfield on its eastern side to oblivion, with tactical ballistic missiles from the 950th Rocket Brigade of the 2nd Combined Arms Army coming in and striking various airfield targets, including this civilian airliner sitting on this taxiway with 2 eye scanners coming straight down upon it when only one was necessary. Sometimes the Russians and Chinese would essentially do what could be considered overkill, hitting a single target with multiple types of munitions or multiples of the same, as they had vast quantities of missiles and artillery to spare. As all these American troops were defeated and rounded up those that survived, the combat engineers and the mechanized infantry moving in behind them, in the form of these 2 battalions, the engineering battalion and the mechanized infantry battalion of the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, had taken the field of battle and could declare a victory over the airfield and the railhead to the north. As again, this is only one segment of the much larger battle unfolding, including the fighting in the north going on at the railhead, as well as fighting to the south, including additional combat engineer companies of the same combat engineer battalion and additional mechanized infantry forces following behind them of the same mechanized infantry battalion that was with the combat engineers. They had their own artillery support as well, as precision strikes came in and hit these MPs trying to get on this high ground to fire down at the enemies that were approaching, but they were spotted well before they even got to the hill by the ISR assets of the different squads monitoring this entire airfield area, which sent back the coordinates and movements of troops that were spotted to Russia's AI systems for processing, which would relay them back to the field commanders on the ground in split seconds, updating them on the ever-changing battlefield condition. It was extremely quick. And as they took the airfield, the engineers would, at some point, begin to try to repair the runway, but this would occur later, as upon the victory over Fort Hood at the end of the battle, they would then begin to be able to truck in cement and other materials needed to repair the runway for their own use. For the time being, they had cleared the airfield fully from this northern